Hi, I'm Warren Sprouse, and you are on the Bible Forum. Unless you live by a van down by the river, you probably know that Megyn Kelly got fired by NBC for daring to mention blackface in a somewhat positive context. It seems in a group discussion about such things, she dared to mention how that as a little girl, she and her friends donned blackface for Halloween. I suppose that's what they were talking about, and really thought nothing of it. It was a statement she uttered not to justify its use, only that in her youth, 30 years ago, no one in her world thought anything about it. In context with the discussion, Kelly told her guest panelists that dressing up in blackface was okay when she was a child, even mused as to whether it was right for white people to dress up for Halloween in blackface if they were playing a character. Well, I guess the answer is no. At least 2 black men on the NBC morning show panel took offense. They were shocked. They were insulted. That what? That she did this as a child? No. That she would say it aloud as though it was okay in her world in those days. And she was branded, well, insensitive to their situation. And NBC fired her. She has a contract that says whether she gets fired or she doesn't get fired, she gets $69 million. And everybody who's weighed in on it says, yeah, she'll get it. Which begs the question, who wins here? But now, video footage has surfaced featuring liberal comedians Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon wearing blackface on TV. And not that long ago, certainly not 30 or 40 years ago. In one video from Comedy Central's The Man Show, which ran from 1999 to 2004, Kimmel, who now hosts ABC's Jimmy Kimmel Live, can be seen impersonating black former Utah Jazz basketball player Karl Malone. During the impression, Kimmel speaks with a defined speech impediment and acts in a manner that suggests he believes Malone is less than intelligent. Did I mention these are white men in blackface? You can look it up. There's a YouTube. Not to mention Sarah Silverman, comedian Sarah Silverman, known far and wide for her bevy of controversial statements, mostly directed at conservatives of different stripes, who did the unthinkable years back when she put on blackface for her TV program. There are pictures. She has since regretted that move. What's this all about? It's all about not losing the black audience, meaning money. These are not legitimate or even serious criticisms. These are things that are being taken out of context to make a point. And the point is, you cannot say stuff like this about black people. You might have been able to do it before, but you can't do it now, and we will cost you $69 million to stop you. In a nation where free speech is a constitutional right. Isn't that amazing? And then there's the social chaos that is the march to the border. You know, that thing is getting bigger. Central Americans are now mixing with Mexicans, and what started out to be a couple of hundred became 2,000 or 3,000, and then it was 7. Now they're estimating it's closer to 10. And everybody wants to know who's behind the march. Who has the power to organize that many people? The Express News said that by mid-October, social media and news media coverage, quote, prompted an explosion in the number of migrants, end of quote. That within days of the caravan's departure from San Pedro Sula on October 13th, almost no one could pin down the group's official origin story. They could cite only the Facebook post or television program that led to their own decision to migrate. And the reality here is that someone or some group got this march going. Smart money says these people are being used for political purposes, which means there are some really evil people in this world. But you knew that. The ordinary people being interviewed are desperate and hopeful. But common sense tells you they haven't got a prayer. Judicial Watch said that all the immigrants it interviewed repeated the same rehearsed line when asked who organized the caravan. They insisted it was a spontaneous event. Quote, even though there were clearly organizers shouting instructions in Spanish and putting select persons in front of the cameras for those interviews, end of quote. Logic tells us that these people have to eat. And if they eat, they must eliminate waste. And they must sleep. Many are requiring medical help, especially as they've been walking for several weeks. It's clear that this migration is not spontaneous, both from a logical point of view and a practical point of view. It's also clear that these people don't want help, not from their government and not from Mexico's government. They were offered the opportunity to stay and have jobs at least looked for by the government, and they said no. We have a border war. Univision reporter Francisco Santa Anna said the borders in Central America are not as strong as the U.S., which makes it possible for people from Panama and Ecuador to cross easily. They cross from Costa Rica, then later go up through Guatemala and eventually make it into our country. Yesterday, when we were traveling through Guatemala, we noticed people from El Salvador and even people from Bangladesh. He asked the question, can you imagine what they had to do to get here? He went on to say they infiltrated themselves in this caravan and tried to cross with the crowd. And would they be able to do that, it would have benefited them greatly. Santa Anna continued to say that they were identified and detained by immigration officials. Just this weekend, it was reported that Mexican officials seem to be listening to President Trump. He is demanding the caravan to stop. He is assuring them that the world, that the United States will not allow these people asylum. The Mexican ambassador to the U.S. admitted Thursday on Fox News that Mexico, believe the caravan to be at least in part politically motivated. He said, we have evidence that this caravan is also very much politically motivated. We're obviously sensitive to the humanitarian situation that we encounter, and we're acting precisely. But we have also made very clear that there's no legal ground on which Mexico can issue a permit by which people can just go through Mexico toward the United States. This has all the earmarks of a very dangerous and destructive confrontation, punctuating the total disregard the organizers have for these poor people. And if all of that is not enough, we now have a movie. The movie is entitled Gosnell, the trial of the biggest mass murderer in history. Have you seen it? When this movie was released last week, 668 theaters decided to hold screenings of this independent film. The movie quickly surpassed expectations by grossing $1.2 million. That according to the publication Daily Wire. It was even put in the top 10 film list. But now 188 of those theaters have dropped the film, 15 of which were top performing. Many were performing very well. Ranking number 6 in a 15-plex theater, number 9 in a 30-plex. 15 theaters were typically a film doing as well as this one would never have been dropped. But this one was. Why? Well, the film is about as shocking as it comes. It's the true story of the investigation and trial of Dr. Kermit Gosnell. It's about his 30-year killing spree, along with the political and media establishment that tried to cover it up. Now, the phrase killing spree in the article is deliberate, since it is now a matter of public knowledge that this doctor deliberately killed living babies outside the womb by snipping their spinal cords, delivering the child, holding the child up, snipping their spinal cords. A gruesome procedure done by one who clearly has no moral standards, not to mention a very strong stomach. The facility was originally investigated for illegal prescription drug sales. A raid by the DEA and FBI, along with local law enforcement there in Philadelphia, revealed crimes that could not have been expected within that clinic. This facility catered to poor women, and it appears no legal standard was sufficient to stop him, and by extension his staff, from killing babies and dispensing drugs that were unlawful. Now, an abortion is murder of a viable human being. That by definition. In the 1973 Roe v. Wade case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that abortion was legal in the first 3 months of gestation. The court did not have in those days access to the sophisticated technology we have today, technology that clearly shows a human baby in that womb well before that 3-month period. Part of the court's decision revolved around the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection under the law. In this case, the baby had to be defined as not human. And as I've told you before, they had drawings because we did not have the technology to see these children in the womb. And they had drawings of what this child would look like at that age. And alongside of it, they had drawings of what other mammals look like in utero. And they made the comparison. See, they're all the same. None of them are fully developed, so that could be very easily any other animal. It didn't have to be a human. We now know better. The movie is based on the New York Times best-selling book Gosnell, The Untold Story of America's Most Prolific Serial Killer, written by producers Anne McElhenney and Phelim McAleer. The book became especially controversial when New York Times initially refused to feature it on its bestsellers list, despite the sales figures that revealed that it should be on the list. And in response, the New York Times admitted they adjust the list as an editorial decision. But then you know that, don't you? You didn't know that? I told you that. Last week or the week before, I can't remember. Don't Doubt me. I used to work for Barnes and Noble. I know about the book business. This is probably the first time that we've seen abortions being labeled as murder. It still remains how we're going to deal with this. And it starts to turn the light on a little brighter when we look back on the Kavanaugh hearings and how many liberals were so adamant that this man could not sit on the U.S. Supreme Court. He would make an unapproachable majority of conservative votes. And they were worried about Roe v. Wade. And the whole thing was swept under the rug and poo-pooed. No, it's not going to be like that. Within weeks, we read in the papers how that there are at least 2 or 3 cases making their way through the system, on their way to the Supreme Court, no doubt, to overturn Roe v. Wade. This movie is evidence. Strap yourself in. It's going to get worser.